My name is Julian Marsh, and for 11 years, I have designed plants that turn things nobody wanted to things everybody needs. Wood chips into ethanol, ethanol into jet fuel, waste into altitude. I have a doctorate in chemical engineering from a university that taught me to trust the numbers before I trust the man standing next to them. That lesson would cost me something later in Longview, Washington. But every lesson worth having cost something. I flew into Portland on a gray Friday morning in October, rented a car, and drove north along the Columbia River until the water turned the color of pewter and the mills began to smell like wet bark and diesel. Longview is a working town. It does not pretend to be anything else. Steam rises from the pulp mills at all hours, and the smell gets into your jacket and stays there for days. I liked it immediately, the way you like anything that does not lie to you about what it is. I worked for Meridian Process Engineering, an EPC firm out of Houston. EPC means engineering, procurement, and construction. We design it, we buy the equipment, we build it, and then we hand over the keys and walk away, hopefully with our reputation intact. Our client on this project was Columbia Skyfuels Corporation, a company built entirely around one bet. That jet fuel made from forest residue could be cheaper, cleaner, and faster to market than anyone thought possible. The process itself is elegant if you have the patience to see it that way. You take lignocellulosic biomass, with chips, bark, the leftover branches that loggers use to burn in slash piles, and you break it down. First, dilute acid pretreatment loosens the tough lignin structure that protects the plant's sugars. Then enzymes go to work, chewing cellulose into glucose, a process we call enzymatic hydrolysis. Yeast ferments the glucose into ethanol, the same chemistry, essentially as a brewery, just built at industrial scale and dressed in stainless steel. Then comes the part that made this project special, alcohol to jet, or AJ. We dehydrate the ethanol into ethylene, oligomerize the ethylene into longer hydrocarbon chains, and hydrogenate those chains into a fuel that meets ASTM D7566, Annex A5, the international standard for synthetic jet fuel blended into commercial aviation. It had taken 3 years to get from a stack of process flow diagrams to a plant standing on the riverbank, gleaming and enormous, waiting to prove itself. I had spent 18 months of those 3 years as lead process engineer, and I felt about that plant the way I imagine a father feels watching his child walk into an exam room. Proud, terrified, slightly nauseous. The performance guarantee test run was supposed to be a formality. 96 hours of continuous operation, sampled and measured against contractual targets, after which Columbia Skyfuels would sign the acceptance certificate and Meridian would collect the final 10% of our fee. The part everyone forgets is still owed until the test proves the plan actually works. Renata Cole met me at the gate that first morning. She was Columbia Skyfuels' VP of Engineering, a woman who walked like she was perpetually late for something more important than the conversation she was currently in. She had a folder under her arm, and she did not offer her hand until she had looked me over first, the way an inspector looks at a weld before deciding whether to sign off on it. Dr. Marsh. She said it flatly, testing the weight of the title. The airline people are flying in Thursday. 4 of them. They want to see the fuel come off spec in front of them live. That's the plan, I said. It had better be more than a plan. Her jaw was tight, and she crossed her arms over the folder, hugging it close, the posture of someone bracing rather than greeting. I have put my name on this project in front of a consortium of airlines who do not forgive slow answers. If something goes wrong in there, I need it fixed before Thursday, not explained after. I told her I understood, and I meant it. What I did not yet know was how completely that promise would be tested. The first sign of trouble came on day 2, in the hydrolysis train. I was standing in the control room with Marcus Ibarra, the field QC manager, a broad-shouldered man with a laminated badge that had gone soft and curled at the corners from years of being wiped on his jacket. He kept glancing at a trend screen and saying nothing, which is its own kind of statement if you know how to listen for it. Glucose yields running low, he finally said, tapping the glass. 62% conversion. Guarantees 78. Show me the feedstock composition, I said. He pulled it up. Lignin content was higher than design basis. Ash content, too. The wood coming off the receiving conveyors was not the clean, consistent hybrid poplar chip we had modeled. It was a rougher blend, heavier in bark, heavier in whatever the loggers had swept up along with the good timber. I felt my stomach drop the particular way it drops when a number refuses to be what you need it to be. Not panic. Something quieter and colder than panic. Recognition. By day 5, the trouble had traveled downstream into the ATJ unit, where it turned from disappointing into dangerous. 5 days, that was how long it took for one bad feedstock delivery to crawl through the whole length of the plant. Fermentation, distillation, dehydration, and finally the reactor itself. The oligomerization reactor's differential pressure began climbing. Any process engineer will tell you what that means. A catalyst bed is fouling, losing its open pathways, choking on something it was never meant to swallow. I ran a mass balance on the ethanol feed and found trace metals, sodium, potassium, calcium, in concentrations well above what the catalyst could tolerate. That part should not have been possible. Sodium, potassium, and calcium salts do not evaporate with ethanol vapor. They belong in the bottoms, not the overhead. But the higher bark and ash content in that week's feedstock had driven heavier foaming in the fermentation broth, and when a column is not built to absorb that much foam, it entrains fine liquid droplets and whatever is dissolved in them, riding out with the vapor instead of staying behind in the reboiler. The distillation train had not failed in the ordinary sense. It had simply been asked to reject more than it was built to reject. I called it catalyst poisoning, and the name is not dramatic exaggeration. A catalyst is a surface built to do one specific job over and over with total reliability, and it will do that job faithfully until something foreign lands on its active sites and will not leave. The reactor does not announce this all at once. It erodes, pressure creeps, selectivity drifts, and then one day the numbers simply will not recover, no matter how gently you coax them. Renata found me in the control room that evening, and I watched her face change as I explained it. Her arms were still crossed, but now her fingers dug into her own elbows, white-knuckled, and there was a stillness in her that was worse than shouting would have been. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that the fuel is not going to meet spec on Thursday. I'm telling you we have a root cause to find before Thursday means anything. And whose root cause is it?" Her voice had an edge now, precise as a blade. "Because I have 3 years of capital and 4 airline partners riding on an answer, and I would like to know whether I am about to explain a design failure or a supply chain failure." I did not have an answer yet. I told her that, honestly, and I watched something in her jaw tighten further, as if my honesty were itself an insult. That night, I called Adam Voss, my project director back in Houston. Adam had brought me onto this project, had vouched for me twice with clients who found my caution unfashionable, and I owed him more than casual loyalty. He picked up on the second ring, already sounding tired in the particular way of a man who has been fielding difficult calls all day. "Julian, tell me it's fixable. It's fixable. I'm not yet sure whose fix it is." Meaning the feedstock coming in is out of spec. Higher lignin, higher ash, higher trace metals than the design basis. That's on the supply side. But I stopped myself, and Adam, who has known me long enough to hear a sentence before I finish it, filled the silence. "But what?" "But our ethanol purification train may not have enough margin to handle real-world feedstock variability. Even feedstock within a reasonable statistical range could push metals past what the catalyst tolerates." I flagged this. During feed, you remember, there was a pause on the line, long enough that I could hear the hum of an air conditioner in his office, 3 states away. "Julian," he said, his voice gone careful now, the tone of a man choosing words meant to close a door rather than open one. "I need you to write me a root cause report that puts this where it belongs, on their feedstock control program, not on our design margin. We are not going to hand Columbia Skyfuels a legal weapon in the middle of a claim negotiation." I sat with the phone against my ear for a moment, saying nothing, and felt something in my chest go very still, The way a reactor goes still right before it either settles or runs away. Adam, that's not a root cause report. That's a legal strategy wearing a lab coat. Call it whatever you want. It's also how you keep a company solvent. It's also how you lose an engineer his license if it ever gets tested in front of a board. I stood up from the desk because sitting suddenly felt like the wrong posture for the conversation and paced to the window, phone pressed hard against my ear, my free hand pressed flat against the cold glass. I'm not going to falsify a root cause analysis, Adam. I'll write you an honest one. If that costs us the claim, it costs us the claim. You're being naive. I'm being an engineer. There's a difference, and I used to think you knew it. The silence that followed was longer than the one before it. Adam, I raised a margin question in feed. There's a memo. If Renata's people pull records during a claim, they will find it, and then the story will not be that we made a defensible engineering judgment. It'll be that we hid one. That memo, Adam said, is exactly why you need to be careful about what you write now. I did not answer that. I told him I would send my analysis when it was complete, and I hung up before either of us could turn the silence into something we would regret. I spent that night the way I spend every night that matters, at a desk, with data, because data does not ask me to choose between people. I pulled the original feed sensitivity study, 3 years old, still sitting in my archive under a file name I had not opened in a long time. I had modeled feedstock variability across a real distribution of Pacific Northwest logging residue. Not an idealized single composition, but a range the kind any competent forester could have told us to expect. My model showed that at the upper end of that realistic range, the purification train's margin against trace metal carryover was thin, not absent. Thin. I had recommended an additional guard bed, a protective layer of adsorbent material placed upstream of the catalyst, designed to intercept exactly this kind of contamination before it could do damage. It would have added $800,000 to a project already fighting for a lump sum price against 2 competing EPC firms. Adam had asked me, in a conference room I can still picture with total clarity, whether the guard bed was essential or conservative. I remember answering, conservative but justified. I remember him saying we would revisit it if commissioning showed a problem. I remember agreeing, because agreeing felt, at the time, like being a team player, and disagreeing felt like being the engineer who could not close a deal. I had traded a memo for a contract. Now, the contract was in front of a catalyst bed that could not breathe. The next morning, I called Priya Chandrasekharan. Priya and I had shared a lab bench for 4 years during our doctoral work, back when we were both certain that good chemistry alone could fix any problem, before either of us had met a client. She now worked as a technology licenser, specializing in oligomerization catalysts, and if anyone could independently verify what was killing this catalyst bed, it was her. Julian Marsh, she said, when she picked up, and I could hear the smile in it, even through the distance. You only call when something has gone wrong at a plant you designed. That is essentially my entire personality now, I admitted. She laughed. And then, because she's the kind of scientist who moves quickly from warmth to work, she asked me to send the spent catalyst sample for XRF analysis and the full ethanol feed assay. I did, that afternoon, overnighting a sample by courier because I did not trust the results to survive a slower shipment. While I waited, I went looking for Marcus Ibarra because something in the way he had tapped that trend screen days earlier had stayed with me. I found him in the receiving yard, standing beside the conveyor that fed raw wood chips into the plant, watching the material tumble past with his arms folded and his weight rocked back on his heels. A man deciding whether a conversation was worth having. Marcus, walk me through receiving inspection, truck by truck if you have to. He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched him make a decision, the kind you can almost see cross a person's face like weather crossing a field. We've been running behind, he said finally. Ramp-up schedule's aggressive. Some loads came in from a new supplier, logging contractor doing forest thinning, not the clean ship mill we spec'd. Bar content's higher. I flagged 2 loads for rejection last month. Got told to blend them in instead. Deadline pressure. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture that carried more confession in it than his words did. Didn't feel right, but it wasn't my call. There it was. Not a single villain. A chain of small, reasonable-sounding decisions, made under pressure by people who were not wrong to feel the pressure. And every one of those decisions had quietly moved the plant closer to the exact failure mode I had once flagged and let go. Priya called 2 days later, and I could hear, in the crispness of her voice, that she had found something worth saying plainly. Your catalyst is dead in the affected zones, she said. XRF shows sodium, potassium, and calcium deposition consistent with alkali metal poisoning, concentrated in the first third of the bed. Classic front-loading, the way a filter clogs first where it works hardest. Feed assay confirms trace metals above what any commercial ATJ catalyst on the market would tolerate long-term. This isn't a manufacturing defect in the catalyst. It's an exposure problem. Could a properly sized guard bed have prevented it? Yes, she said, without hesitation. That's literally the textbook function of a guard bed. I'm surprised there isn't one already. Honestly, given what you told me about your feedstock range. I thanked her and sat for a long moment afterward in the quiet of my hotel room, looking out at the river, feeling the particular ache of being right about a thing I wished I had been wrong about. The original Thursday, the one Renata had mentioned to me at the gate on my first morning, had already come and gone by then, quietly, unremarked, since everyone already knew it would not be met and had stopped pretending otherwise. The claims meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday morning, 2 days before the airline representatives were due to fly in for the rescheduled demonstration. Adam flew in the night before, and when I met him in the hotel lobby, he looked at me like a man bracing for a colleague to make his life harder. "You're going to tell them about the guard bed," he said. It was not a question. I'm going to tell them the truth. The feedstock was out of spec. That part is real, and it is on their supply chain. But our purification train also lacked adequate margin for realistic feedstock variability, and that gap is on us. I flagged it in feed. There's a memo, Adam. I'm not going to sit in a room and let a paper trail contradict me to my face. You understand what that costs us. I understand what it costs me if I don't say it. My hands were steady, but my voice was not entirely, and I let that show because some things are not meant to be said in a perfectly level tone. I have spent 11 years building a reputation on being the engineer who tells clients the number even when the number is inconvenient. I'm not going to burn that now to protect a contract. Adam looked at me for a long time, his jaw working, and then he exhaled through his nose and nodded once, the smallest possible surrender. Fine, but you carry it, all of it, in the room. I will. The conference room at Columbia Skyfuel's site office had a long table and a window that looked out over the plant itself, steam rising white against a gray sky. Renata sat at the head of the table with her folder open in front of her, and beside her sat 2 people from her legal team, and Marcus quietly near the back, invited, I suspected, in case anyone needed a witness to the receiving yard. I stood to present, because standing felt honest, felt like something a man does when he intends to be looked at directly. There are 2 root causes, I said, and I want to walk through both because a single cause story would be a comfortable lie, and I did not come here to tell you a comfortable lie. Renata's eyebrows lifted slightly, a small flicker of surprise crossing a face that had, until that moment, been braced for a defense. I laid out the feedstock data first. The bark content, the lignin, the ash, the 2 rejected loads that were blended back in under schedule pressure. I watched Marcus at the back of the room go very still, and then, almost imperceptibly, nod, as if grateful the truth was finally being spoken by someone whose job did not depend on staying quiet about it. Then I laid out the second half. The feed sensitivity study. The guard bed I had recommended and not fought hard enough for. The margin that had been thin rather than absent, and had, under real-world stress, proven not thin enough. This was not one failure, I said. It was 2 decisions, made independently, each of them defensible in isolation, that combined into a result neither side intended. Your feedstock program needs tighter receiving specifications and enforcement authority that doesn't get overridden by schedule pressure. Our design needs a guard bed we should have installed from the start, and I take responsibility for not pushing harder when I had the data in front of me 3 years ago. The room was silent for a moment. Then one of the lawyers, a thin man with a legal pad he had not written on once during my entire presentation, leaned forward and tapped his pen against the table, 3 sharp clicks, like a man testing whether a door was really unlocked. "Dr. Marsh," he said, "are you telling this room, on the record, that Meridian's design contained a known deficiency at the time of contract signing?" I felt Adam shift beside me, the small, involuntary tightening of a man bracing for impact. I did not look at him. "I'm telling you the design contained a known, quantified risk," I said. "One I judged, at the time, to be acceptable. I was wrong about how acceptable it was. That is different from concealment, and I will say so under oath as readily as I am saying it now. That's a fine distinction. It's an honest one. Take it or don't." The lawyer sat back, and Renata lifted one hand slightly off the table, a small, almost lazy gesture, but was enough to still him completely, the way a conductor's hand stops an orchestra mid-phrase. She did not look at him again. She looked at me. "Keep going," she said. I finished laying out the corrective path. The guard bed, the feedstock specification, the timeline. And when I stopped speaking, the room stayed quiet a moment longer than rooms usually do after a presentation ends. Renata's arms, which had been crossed through most of my time at that whiteboard, slowly uncrossed, and she leaned forward instead, elbows on the table, chin resting against her folded hands. The posture, I've come to notice, of someone finally listening rather than merely waiting to respond. "You could have blamed us entirely," she said. "Your director would have let you." "He would have," I said. I decided I would rather be trusted than protected. She studied me for a moment longer, and something in her face loosened, the tightness around her eyes, easing the way tension leaves a structure once a load has finally found its proper support. "What do you need from us to fix it before Thursday afternoon?" We spent the next several hours in that room, designing a path forward instead of an argument. A guard bed, expedited from a vendor who kept standard adsorbent skids in inventory for exactly this kind of emergency, installed within the existing pipe rack footprint with no structural redesign needed. I had, in fact, sketched its layout 18 months earlier and simply never been asked to build it. A revised feedstock specification, with rejection authority restored fully to Marcus and anyone standing where he stood. A delay to the test run, a full week, that Renata would call and explain to the airlines herself before any of them boarded a plane, with the same directness I had just shown her. "They will respect a delayed truth," she said, more than an on-time excuse. The guard bed went in on a Tuesday, and by Friday the reactor's differential pressure had stabilized, and the following Monday, glucose yield climbed back above guarantee once feedstock receiving finally enforced its own specification. The airlines came a week later than planned, watched fuel come off spec exactly the way it was supposed to, and sign what everyone in the room needed them to sign. Renata found me afterward, out by the receiving yard, where I had gone to watch the conveyor run clean feedstock for the first time since I had arrived. The consortium's cars were already pulling out of the gravel lot behind us, and for once neither of us had anywhere urgent to be. "You look like a man at a funeral," she said, coming to stand beside me, close enough that I could see she had finally let her shoulders drop from the tight, guarded line they had held all week. "We just passed. We passed because of a part one should have built 3 years ago. That's not exactly a moment for champagne." She was quiet for a while, watching the chips tumble off the belt, and when she spoke again her voice had none of the edge it had carried the first morning at the gate. "Do you know how many engineers I've sat across from who would have let Adam's version stand?" she said. "Who would have handed me a report blaming my supply chain and gone home clean? A few, I guess. More than a few." She turned to face me directly, arms loose at her sides now instead of crossed, a stance I had not seen on her before that week. "I've built a career reading people who are about to lie to me in very precise technical language. You didn't do that. You stood in a room full of my lawyers and took a piece of the blame nobody was forcing you to take. It was mine to take. Most people don't know the difference between what's theirs and what's convenient." She almost smiled, the corner of her mouth lifting before she caught it, as though smiling still felt like a small luxury after the week we'd had. I mean this plainly, Julian, not as a courtesy. She held my eyes. Your root cause analysis was the most honest piece of engineering work anyone has put in front of me in 11 years in this industry. I'm going to say that to your management on the record, whether or not it's what they want to hear. I did not have a practiced answer for that, which is, I think, its own kind of compliment. The ones that catch you without a response are usually the ones worth keeping. Thank you, I finally said. That matters more to me than the acceptance certificate does. It should. She held out her hand, and this time there was no inspection in it, no weighing of a weld before signing off. Just a plain, firm handshake, the kind exchanged between equals who have already done the harder work of trusting each other. Next expansion phase, I'm asking for you by name. Not Meridian. You. Adam did not fare so well in the accounting that followed. Columbia Skyfuel's formal letter to Meridian's leadership, the one Renata had promised and delivered, praised my root cause analysis by name and noted, in a single blunt sentence, that the feed stage guard bed recommendation had been raised and subsequently declined for reasons the letter characterized as commercial rather than technical. That sentence found its way, as sentences like that do, into a client relations review back in Houston. Adam kept his position, but he lost the Skyfuels account to another director within the month, and I heard secondhand that he was asked in a partners' meeting to explain, in writing, why documented engineering risk had been overruled without a compensated control. He never asked me to help him write that explanation, and I understood why. Some debts are not the kind a colleague can help you settle. I saw him once more before I left Houston for good, in a hallway rather than an office, both of us moving in different directions. He stopped, and for a moment neither of us said anything. You were right, he said finally, not quite meeting my eyes. About the memo. About all of it. I know. I'm not going to pretend that's easy to hear. It isn't easy to say either, and it wasn't. Some part of me had wanted, all along, to be wrong about him, the way you sometimes want to be wrong about a crack you've spotted in a structure you'd rather trust. The quiet discovery that he had never quite been carrying the weight I had always assumed he was carrying. We were still colleagues, on paper, for a little while longer. We were no longer, I think, quite the same kind of partners. I flew out of Portland on a clear morning in November, the mountains visible for once above the haze, and somewhere over Idaho, I found myself thinking about margin. Not the commercial kind, the kind that shows up on a spreadsheet as a percentage protecting profit, but the engineering kind, the deliberate, sometimes expensive space we build into a design specifically for the moment reality refuses to behave the way our models predicted it would. I had spent years building that margin into plants and forgetting, somehow, to build any into myself, into my own tolerance for disappointing the people whose approval I wanted. Renata Cole had not needed me to be flawless. She had needed me to tell her the truth early enough to matter, and to keep telling it even after it stopped being convenient. A guard bed does not prevent contamination. It simply refuses to let contamination travel further than it has to before someone notices and does something about it. I think, now, that is the best any of us can really offer one another. Not a perfect feedstock, not a life free of variability, but an honest layer standing between our worst inputs and the parts of us that were never built to survive them unprotected. The plant is running well now, I am told. Fuel leaves that dock on the Columbia River in tanker trucks bound for a blending terminal, where it never travels alone. The certification we design around, ASTM D7566 Annex A5, permits synthetic jet fuel to be blended into conventional fossil-derived jet, one at up to 50% by volume. But the consortium's offtake agreement was more cautious than that, the way most large fleets are cautious about anything new entering their fuel supply, and it set the working ratio at 25%, half of what the chemistry would allow, and, for now, exactly as much as anyone was willing to trust. The two fuels mix into a single stream, indistinguishable at the nozzle, indistinguishable in the wing tank, indistinguishable to every passenger boarding every flight that burns it. I used to find that ratio almost disappointing, as though our work were only ever going to be a minority partner in someone else's fuel. I don't feel that way anymore. A quarter of every gallon, quietly displacing what would otherwise have come entirely from the ground, is not a small thing. It is, if anything, its own kind of guard bed, a fraction of the system built deliberately to intercept some of the damage before it reaches the sky, without pretending it can catch all of it at once. Eventually, somewhere over an ocean I will never personally cross, that blended fuel becomes altitude for people who will never know my name, never know Renata's, never know that a good part of what carries them safely aloft was decided on the ground in a conference room by two stubborn people who finally chose to stop protecting themselves and started, instead, protecting the truth. That, I have come to believe, is the only guarantee test that actually matters.